through. So what I want to do is I will briefly introduce, go through a broad overarching picture of what I see the sector's going based on the world that I've been involved in. I'll then throw over to Jim Caddy, who'll talk particularly from his perspective of the inland wine regions. But I will make this point now that this is not just inland and cool climate. This is what we're going to talk about will apply to the whole sector. And then we've got a good presentation from Ben Mislov from Flinders Ports, who is going to talk to me what I think is one of the biggest and most serious possible impacts on this vintage and ongoing vintages as well. He'll talk about the freight and logistics issues. Then we'll throw to the panel Q&A. So I might kick off just very briefly now. So from my presentation, I won't use any slides. I'll talk a little bit about what I see vintage 22 going like, with some of those global developments that you're all fairly well aware of and the domestic implications of those, and then some of the sort of the next steps that we see. I think the reason we really thought this was a useful presentation to start with was that I've been talking a lot with politicians in the last week or two, and the thing that has been astonishing me is that they don't believe that there is any major impacts from China. They believe that we have got through the China issue very, very quickly and very, very well, and that they don't think it's going to have a long-lasting impact on vintage. As a result of that, we've done a lot of pretty significant briefings for them. These are all sides of politics, and that we're going forward to make sure that people understand what we see is like happen to vintage and what are the major drivers. So the state of the sector at the moment, we all saw the vintage report for 2021. We all know it was a pretty big vintage. It was over 2 million tonnes, the biggest, I think, on record, certainly the biggest I remember. And I guess what was more interesting was the fact that the massive growth in red grapes from that. We saw a really big increase in red grapes. The good news from that vintage, of course, is that stocks were well down after the 3 smaller vintages we've had. We've seen that domestic and off-premise cellar door sales were very high in that COVID-19 variety. So if you're a small domestic producer, you went pretty well during COVID. We also see the internet and mail order sales. They've increased dramatically over this time. And of course, white wine and sparkling demand will remain high into the near future. And of course, domestic on-premise market, we're all pretty happy it's going to come online again, and that's going to have a major impact, particularly for those smaller producers. The other big issue, of course, is global market dynamics. And we do know that grape prices, in particular in Australia, are affected by those global market, those international prices. Jim will talk a lot more about this, but some of our big competitors, they've had below average vintages. So in Europe, we saw France with the most affected, about 25% down on last year. Italy was around 9% down. Spain was down about 30%. And so overall, we saw the European harvest down around, it was about 22.9 million hectolitres. I think it was a fair bit down. So we're seeing some of our major competitors. We saw the low vintage in New Zealand. And of course, that has a positive impact for some of Australia wine, particularly in our exports. The export stats have been pretty unpleasant for those of you reading export stats like I do. Obviously, the big fall has been China, and I'll talk a bit about China in more detail in a minute. With that, 62% in the last 12 months, obviously it's gone to virtually zero. So it's going to be a much bigger drop over those months go out. It's been masked a bit because we've seen those increases to Hong Kong and Macau. So there's been a big increase there. And of course, South Korea has been the big mover up. It's gone up 81% to about 46 million. So it's 8th on the leaderboard, but still the point I'm trying to make is that even with growth in those markets, it's not going to have any impact on the loss we've had with China. So the China impact, we saw that was a bit of an impact on prices at the end of last vintage, but in general, prices held up pretty well for reds. Of course, whites were in short supply. But it's very clear that the domestic market also remains very important to us. I think I've been told a lot that China's not going to have a big impact because it's a warm climate problem. So warm climate grapes, that's not the case. China does have a big problem. It was around only about 100 million litres. That's right. That's 10% of our production. But the point is, a lot of that was premium product, and what we've seen in some of the latest statistics. So we've seen that really high value premium wine of greater than about $50 a litre. That would normally have been about 40 odd million in the last quarter. It was down to about 3. We've seen that Australia has not been making enough progress in its export markets to move high value reds. So we've moved some. We've probably picked up about 40% of that across the markets, but we still 60% is unallocated and is looking for a home. So it's not a warm climate region. It's not a cool climate problem. It's a problem for the whole sector. Vintage 22, I haven't got a crystal ball. It's looking from the early signs of flowering and all the rest of it that it should be a reasonably good vintage. Obviously, though, we're heading into a La Nina, which means that we're looking for a lot more wet weather coming up. We're looking for those storm cell activities. We saw the problems that caused in South Australia and Victoria over the last week or so. We've seen big storm cells in New South Wales as well. So we've lost some crop in some of those regions from that, and there's likely to be a lot more storm cell activity. So I'm not going to predict what's going to happen with the vintage because I can't, but we do know that what we do know is that it's likely to be a reasonable sized vintage, at least around average. The other thing, of course, is that there's still very, very high stocks in place. And so then these stocks are going to be maintained much higher than we wanted to because of the freight issues. And Ben will talk about that down the track. But freight is not just about a problem of input and about shipping delays and shortage of containers. It's a problem of getting export product offshore. It's a big impact on trying to diversify our markets. And if you haven't got product on the water to Christmas to the UK, you're not going to get it now. So, people need to be planning early, often and quickly. I want to talk a little bit about the issues. I mean, China, let's talk briefly about China. We've taken a World Trade Organization action on China. That's not going to solve any problems in the short, medium or long term. Even when we win the case, and we will win the case, it doesn't mean that automatically those tariffs go to zero and China left product back in. It doesn't happen like that. And until that political situation improves, we're not going to get better access into the China market. And it's some time to come before that will happen. So I think if you're looking at China to get you out of any sort of supply problem over the next year or two, forget it. It's more a 5-year or a 10-year issue. And if you remember, Norway had an issue around giving a Nobel Peace Prize to a dissident in China. That was in the 70s, I think. They still haven't got any trade back with China after that. So long memories and a difficult market once you're out. So we've obviously seen that I think in 2022, any of those wineries without strong brands or strong domestic exposure will come under pressure. It's very clear that red grape prices will come under pressure, which Jim will talk about. And as I say, it's not just warm climate or cool climate. They're both going to come under pressure. You've also seen the emerge of Endeavour drinks from Woolworths. Make no mistake, Woolworths and Coles are both looking at increasing their footprint in the wine side and in the production side. And if they see a whole lot of grapes coming in at a low price, they'll be looking at increasing their own brand. The other thing, of course, is labour shortages. And again, labour will come into play. We dodged a bullet last year. We were lucky that we didn't have a compressed vintage. If we have a compressed vintage, that will cause real problems. You've probably heard about the agriculture visa, which the federal government, that's not going to be a solution for this vintage. They're looking at four countries that then they're trying to negotiate bilateral deals with them to allow that to happen. So even if we do get some relief, it's not going to be enough to overcome some of those picking problems, certainly not to overcome our labour problems in hospitality, and certainly not to overcome those problems of lack of winemakers coming in and running a vintage. So there's some real emerging and existing issues. The good news is COVID means that we will open up at some stage down the track, so we can see some medium-term improvements. But again, these are medium-term. I just want to say a couple of quick points about freight before I throw over to Jim and before Ben will talk more. Freight, to me, is not a short-term problem. Freight and logistics are going to be both domestic and international problems due to the situation that won't be resolved before the next couple of years. So it's something to live with. It means if you need to order inputs for this vintage, do it now. Talk to your suppliers. The prices will be higher. there will be people trying to get your space on a ship if you're bringing it from inside. So you need to lock those deals in early and lock them in well. As I say, China relations are at freezing point. We've all seen what French submarines have done to our relations with Europe. Free trade agreements with Europe has been put on hold following the submarines debacle. About the only good measure internationally has been the UK and the UK deal, which will be signed off soon. One thing about Europe put a lot of support measures in about COVID. So when people keep talking about the opportunity because European wine and Chilean wine will be going into China, leaving a gap, China market has slowed. It's slowed substantially. And the European market, it's very slow demand. We've seen, for even a lower vintage, we've seen that the demand for wine is actually well down. So we're seeing a slowing in their market. We're also seeing a very highly subsidized market. There's around, for example, Spain are putting about 200 million euros into subsidies this year. We're seeing a lot of that money last year for COVID went into stocks, increasing the subsidies for stocks. So you're going to see some highly subsidized product seeking some of those markets externally. So very quickly, my message is it's not terribly encouraging this vintage. The fact is that we're going to have a very tough vintage in prices for red grapes. We're going to have very tough market conditions. We've got the ACCC that will be looking over the shoulder of all winemakers. So I would encourage winemakers and grape growers to make sure that they are signatories to the code of conduct and that certainly talk early to talk often. I think we are doing a good work on market diversification, medium-term strategy. In the short term, it's going to be, I think, a very, very difficult time. So that's all from me. Jim, I will now introduce Jim Caddy, who will bring a much more cheery view on the world from the grape grower perspective. And just Jim's a man who really follows the numbers really well. I've got a lot of respect for the work he does. Jim, it's over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, look, the wine industry is basically, for whatever we want to say, it's a game of numbers, particularly. You spoke about China only being 10%, which it was, of our total production. However, it was 20% of our red production. So, and that's pretty substantial. And it was pretty well spread right through the whole price structure. And there was a lot of value add in it. So volume-wise, it wasn't huge. It was about 197,000 tonnes, somewhere around about that at our peak. So yeah, we'll have, and I don't care what anybody says, it won't come back. You can dream whatever you like, but the Chinese have long memories. So we've got to start looking somewhere else. So we all know 21 vintage was probably as big as we've ever had at 2.03. Consumption up to June 30, 2021 was about 1.67 million tonne. So we've got a little bit over. Of that, domestic's about 690,000. So I'm going to talk tonnes, not litres. It's been converted at the rate of about 710 litres a tonne. And exports about 975,000 tonne. About 65% is in bulk, and the rest is in bottled. And domestic sales grow a little bit every year. I think the inland regions, and by inland regions we mean Riverland, Riverina, and the Murray Valley, Swan Hill regions, those inland warm irrigated regions, who account for about 70% of production, about 80% by volume. So domestic sales tend to grow a little bit. We saw a kick from COVID in wine sourced out of those three regions, in the cask and the lower price in the take-home system. Hopefully the cooler regions will get a kick now that some of the restaurants are starting to open, and we'll see it come back there. Our exports are actually down by about 225,000 tonne. They peaked in volume in 2018. And obviously, because of the shorter vintages in 19 and 20, they dropped out. It's going to be really difficult to get it back. It's fine for some people to say, oh, you just got to find new markets and develop. Well, we currently export to about 120 odd countries, I think. There's only about 160 or 70 of them. And a lot of those don't drink and can't afford wine. So we're pretty well saturated a lot of them. So it won't be easy. So when it comes to stock, that's one of our biggest fears at the moment, is that the stock levels have possibly blown out a bit. And then there is some concern about whether we can get 2022 vintage in. The 10-year average for stocks to sales on reds at about 1.58. Currently, they're sitting at about 1.92 for reds. And the whites are a different ballgame. They're at 1.3, and that's their long-term average. So that's about where they have to be. So a balanced ratio for reds is about 1.45. So they may need to look at that a little bit later on. One of the biggest problems, and this has probably got a lot to do with freight, is that the September quarter in 21 and the September quarter for 20, there's about, for reds, we're down by about 40 million litres. So that stocks to sales is not going to improve. In whites, we're down by about 10, but that's sort of explainable because we don't produce as much white. Unfortunately, there's been a changeover to reds a little bit. Tony spoke about world wine supply before. Those major countries producing have had a below average year. However, if you have a look at the last 5 years, world wine supply versus the demand, we were currently going into this year with a cumulative excess of about 11.2 billion litres. When you consider that Australia produces about 1.4 billion, there's still plenty of wine out there in the world. I know France and some of Europe was talking about turning some of their excess into alcohol. I believe that's now being suspended. So that wine's going to be floated around out on the market. Unfortunately, the bulk wine prices have been dropping for reds. And I emphasise reds only. The white have either been holding or are rising slightly since last year. We need some good news, I guess. Well, the good news is in the whites. It is going to be difficult for your major three red, your Shiraz, Cabernet and Merlot. However, most of the white varieties are in good demand, an exceptional demand for things like Sauvignon Blanc. There's no doubt there's a big demand out there for that. Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, quite good. Some of the other minor whites, Riesling seems to be going along all right. When it comes to reds, there's a huge demand for Pinot Noir at the moment. So that's one of the good news. And there's also a lot of niche inquiry for things like Grenache Mataros. You know, it's not big numbers, but if you've got some of it, be aware that there's a reasonable demand for those. Yeah, so why has the reds come down? Well, basically, it's the wine designated for China is coming back into the market. And unfortunately, some of the wine that was due to go to China isn't suitable for some of our new markets. It was relatively high alcohol. It was sort of the old style wine that we used to produce. And the countries where, you know, the UK and the US aren't chasing that high alcohol wine anymore, heavy stuff. We're tending towards a lighter wine. Freight prices, which I'm sure will be explained later on. And just slots are difficult to get. So it's really hard to fulfill orders. That's the big problem. The last I looked, the freight rate for a container gone up to equivalent of about 12 cents a litre, which is about $85 a tonne equivalent for bulk wine. So, and that was quite, and it's probably gone up a little bit more since I saw that. So that's one of the problems. Future markets, we spoke about where we have to, well, I'm not sure there are too many more markets out there that we can take hold of. I think we can operate better in a lot of them. Maybe we're not producing the right wine for those markets. We may have to change our mindset. You know, let's not care what we sell them. Let's make sure that we're looking at what the consumer wants, and that's what we sell, not what we want. There is cost pressures. Most of the costs of the winemakers are going up. Things like tartaric and all of their inputs are starting to increase, so that's going to create pressure on the winemakers. Obviously, as a grape grower, our costs are going up too. So anybody's bought a tonne of urea recently. Unfortunately, about a month ago, I bought some, and I bought some the other day, and they've gone up by about $250 a tonne. So that's just your shipment costs. So we're also under the pressure. So what's going to happen? There is an oversupply of red grapes. I'd like to sugarcoat it, but I can't. But there's really good demand for whites. I would expect to see price increases for some whites. I would have expected price increases for all whites, but due to the freight costs and some of the input costs, I'm not sure that will happen, but they certainly shouldn't go down. So I think the big three reds, there's certainly pressure for them to come down in price. I'd like to implore the winemakers. One of the biggest gripes that the growers have got at the moment is that no one's talking to us. Please, winemakers, I beg you, get out, talk to your growers, inform them. Tell them what you're going to do. You know, if you don't want their fruit, stuff that you've taken and it's not contracted, tell them so that at least they can get out and have a look and look for alternatives, and don't waste money trying to produce a big crop. It really is going to be difficult in the red wine industry over the next 2 or 3 years. And it's the one time that the two groups, the winemakers and grape growers, really do have to come together. So that's about all I've got.
Thanks, Jim. That was a really good, clear presentation. I'd just like to add my same view of that, is that grape growers and winemakers need to talk now. This is a long-term relationship that needs to be preserved. It does no one any credit if there's if we have too much pressure put on because people don't know what's happening. Grape growers need to know, winemakers need to talk to them. It's going to make things a lot more smooth in the future if we can make sure we get out there now. And it must be, it's not just grape growers and winemakers. If you're buying inputs, talk to your suppliers and make sure you understand what's happening there. And please don't try just in time. It's not going to work. So look, we'll come back, and I'm sure there'll be a few questions for you, Jim, at the end. So I would now like to pass over to Ben Mislov. Ben's from Flinders Ports. He's at the front and centre of seeing what's happening on this global freight issue. So Ben, I'll throw it to you.
Thank you, Tony. All right, just quickly, for those who aren't aware, I'll just say that Flinders Ports Holdings, we own and operate Flinders Adelaide Container Terminal, as well as 6 other regional ports around the state. We also provide integrated supply chain solutions through Flinders Logistics and Flinders Warehousing and Distribution, which is the division I'm involved with. We employ around 700 people, indirectly support around 6,000 jobs across the state, and through our total operations, we facilitate around 25 billion in international trade annually through our platforms and two-way trade in and out of South Australia. For those who aren't aware, Flinders, we have 3PL capabilities. We have 20,000 square metres of fully insulated, ambient temperature controlled warehousing, which obviously is good for the people listening in today. It's the old Hardy/Constellation/Accolade website. So if anyone has any requirements in that space, please do reach out. We also offer quarantine services for imports through heat treatment, fumigation, tailgate, etc., etc. So that is us in a nutshell. But looking at the overall global supply chain, it's not great. And I guess the question is, why is it so messy? So we've always faced issues with our global supply chain: economic reform, demand fluctuation, weather events, rate increases, terrorism, industrial action, war, etc. However, the onset of COVID-19 really forced the global economy into a lockdown event that we've really never seen the likes of before. So following that initial lockdown, we've been gripped with a sudden and massive surge in demand that really outweighs the market's capacity. So the global supply chain infrastructure that exists simply can't handle the volume of product that is flowing through the economies at the moment. Now, the root cause of this, I mean, there's a lot of issues that sort of snowball into one, but we can really look at the sort of extraordinary government stimulus across the globe from a lot of Western society that have just tipped in copious amounts of money, which has ended up in the hands of consumers. And as such, those consumers and businesses have really gone and spent it. So the transfer of money coincided with a shift in customer demand from, say, purchasing services to actually purchasing physical product. And we've seen basically the global economy race through trillions of dollars of inventory and domestic inventory, while domestic and global production was shut down. So simply stated, production was shut down while global economy went into demand overdrive. The production came back online. The manufacturing sector responded by fulfilling unprecedented back orders. But as such, container ships are put into work to move cargo across our oceans, but the logistics infrastructure simply can't cope with the current demand in such a short period of time. And what we find is that each touch point in the chain has its own problems. A lack of containers, yes. Port congestion, yes. Trucks shortage, yes. Rail overcapacity, yes. A big one is labor. With stimulus checks being handed out, people are happy to sit at home and not necessarily work. So that's sort of the situation we're in, or the reasons, a brief overview of the reasons why we're in that position. And interestingly, global production is up about 4% on what we would normally see. So it's not a huge increase. It's just that it's just happened in one big hit, is why we're in the situation we are. I'll just share the screen if I can. Bear with me a second. This will give us just a bit of an overview of sort of the global and Australian container volumes. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but Australia represents 1% of total global container throughput. Bear in mind that this presentation, or what I'm talking about, is a little bit Adelaide or South Australian centric, but it applies nationally for the most part. So Adelaide in turn represents 5% of our 1% in total volume. The main east-west routes, Asia, Europe, Trans-Pacific, and Asia, East Coast, North America, are the main corridors for global trade. And we're really just considered a niche trade lane, north-south trade, which sort of pales into insignificance alongside the other major trade routes. So a large chunk of Australia's throughput feeds into the east-west trade, and we are heavily reliant on the likes of Singapore, Tanjung Palapas, and Port Klang. And to a large degree, we're at the mercy of the global container network and the supply-demand principles that govern those network structures. So in this slide, you can see that the red arrow, which makes up 2/3 of global output, comes from the Asian region. The rest is made up by Europe and North America and other regions outside of Asia. And then our portion, we can see Melbourne at 3 million containers throughput a year, Sydney 2.65 million, Brisbane 1.38, Fremantle 760,000, and Adelaide at roughly 420,000. So we are very small in the global picture. This particular slide will give you an example of our line of service and how they arrive, whether it's on time or not on time. And it's been consolidated, like obviously they come in from Monday through to Friday and on weekends as well, but it's been consolidated into just looking at, say, a Tuesday for the ease of the exercise. The light pink is that window, and you can see where the vessels land for the most part with inside that window or just on the outside. Generally, they're a little early rather than late. And there's some, there's a few examples in there where they have been late. One, there was a captain of a particular vessel that was hospitalised, had to obviously be replaced. We have weather-related incidents, and we've also had delays due to sort of the Australian Maritime Safety Authority looking at vessels prior to docking and making assessments as to whether they're safe to dock or not. And sometimes they're not, and they need to be rectified before they can call the port. If we go to the next slide, that looks at, sorry, that was pre-COVID. This is looking at COVID. So you can see where vessels arrived around the window, which they haven't, essentially. It's really scattergun, and the ones that do arrive in the window are generally rescheduled, so they're actually delayed in any case. But the key factor there is the number of sailings, which has dropped significantly. Previously, it was at 52 sailings for the month, or arrivals for the month. In this instance, we can see we're down to 42. And this creates the issues that a lot of, I guess, the people listening in today who are exporting are faced with. If we look at this slide here of our container yard, we can see that it's essentially empty. And speaking with the guys within the organisation who've been here for some time, they struggle to recall seeing it that empty. And we have a situation where we're expecting 9 vessels for a week and none have arrived. So the containers just aren't there. And then on the flip side of that, this was a shot taken yesterday. We're at 120% capacity because we've had an influx of containers arrive. So the yard is just bursting at the seams in this instance. If we look at our services, obviously again a north-south service, we can see here that pretty much all of our trade is heading back via Tanjung Palapas, Singapore, and Port Kelang. We have weekly services, obviously, but you can just see the rotation and how reliant we are going via those relay services, as we don't really have many direct calls anymore. So if we look at the global bottleneck and hotspots, this information, I guess, it's fluid and it's always changing. But if we start with what we face here in Australia, which directly impacts our exporters, we're seeing industrial, like this is on top of COVID and as a result of COVID. But we have industrial action at Patrick's in Victoria, at Hutchins, ongoing enterprising agreements. These are resulting in work stoppages. This affects Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Fremantle. And we have bottlenecks in China, New Zealand, Southeast Asia. Relay hubs also impacted by these. Our arrival time, similar thing applicable to Europe. They have increased demand in Asian imports. They've seen ports struggle to manage high throughput in conjunction with dealing with labour shortages, with border lockdowns and the like, as countries just aren't letting labour in to assist. Then we have COVID outbreaks. One outbreak, one case generally means a port can shut down for 2 weeks. And again, it snowballs. You throw in instances like the Suez Canal, where the Ever Given blocked the port or blocked that passage for the best part of 10 days. Again, it delays. Again, that multiplier effect. Southern China in particular, it's the world's production line, I guess, and they've been very stringent on any outbreaks. So we see Yantian close down. We've seen Ningbo close down just in recent weeks, where one case has brought the whole port service industry to a halt in those areas. West Coast, America, I guess that's the one that's kind of making the headlines and a lot of noise. Oakland, or more Long Beach and Los Angeles, but Oakland, Tacoma, Seattle, all these ports are facing these issues that are seen around the world, and many others that I haven't highlighted here. But if we have a look at this particular picture, this one, I'm assuming most people have seen who have some interest in export or import and the issues we're facing. But 70 vessels anchored off Long Beach, and on the smaller map, there's four vessels I just point to here, which is circled in yellow. They're Australian or vessels that called Australia with export cargo that's heading to the US. That represents a month worth of sailings out of Australia to the US, and that's been sitting there for weeks, just waiting to dock. And the problem is, if we look at the US ports, for example, they have the ability to process the point of view, but where that's transport, getting containers out of the terminal, getting containers from the terminal to the railheads, which get containers to the inland distribution centers, and that's just not happening. And a recent stat was America currently estimated around 88,000 trucks and drivers short of where they need to be to help get this back into a position that, essentially getting regular transmission back. And that's just not going to happen. While stimulus checks are still being given, an aging workforce in that particular industry, we see a lot of drivers, low margins, they're just saying it's not worth it. And it's a hard job. I mean, there's delays, there's waiting time, there's the stress of carrying, heavy loads through the streets of LA to get to distribution centers. It's not pleasant, and they're treated poorly in most instances. So you can sort of see why there are these ongoing issues. This particular slide looks at vessel calls to the South Australia, or to Adelaide predominantly, and we can see what we've budgeted for and the actual calls. And again, this, like, we're down 18% on the number of calls we would expect. This is obviously COVID figures, and because things are so fluid and services are changing, it's hard to get data that actually represents what's actually happening at the moment. But if we went back to pre-COVID times, on average, our last pre-COVID year, we had 430 vessel calls approximately, and five were missed. So now again, if we go back to that or the earlier slides, it's just a mess, and it's all over the place. And obviously this just compounds and makes the situation a lot worse for exporters. I guess this point here, regional and global freight rate developments and what's happening there. Obviously the graph on the right, it represents what we've seen for ocean freight rates over the past 18 months. And we've used the Adelaide Shanghai port pair. And obviously Australia is mainly an importing country, obviously, but export rates have also doubled over that time, which is obviously going to affect our grape growers who are listening in today. And while that hasn't been ideal, if we look at import rates as well, that's increased sixfold. So as demand spiked for imports in the middle of 2020, the rates started to obviously head north. Export rates have remained fairly stable up until Q1 of 21. And then it became apparent that unless export cargo were prepared to pay a premium, there are really no guarantees for container supply. And basically, carriers have been instructed to return units to North Asia and in many instances empty if necessary, which again compounds what our exporters require to get back to more lucrative markets. So when will that change? I don't think next year, maybe late next year, maybe early 2024. Hopefully we can see things improve. But the current predicament is really played out in 3 stages. Obviously, with the first lockdown, liner operators started blank sailing and suspending services. Some were cancelled completely. And this falsified the rates, but it kept them from collapsing. Then the government stimulus obviously increased in demand for consumer goods, resulted in huge demand for cargo space, and then throw in events like Ever Given, port closures due to COVID outbreaks, and we're in the position where we are now. This particular shot is an interesting one for exporters, I guess, as a rule, but this particular vessel came in several weeks back now when this photo was taken, but it's since made 2 additional calls. But it's collected 1,600 empty containers, and it hasn't taken a single container with finished goods or cargo on it. These are all simply to be repositioned back into into China for the East-West trade to Europe and the US. The other 2 calls this vessel's made have been around 1,400 40-foot units and 1,200 40-foot units. So again, under normal circumstances, that vessel would be, taking wine, taking finished goods out. But at the moment, there's higher paying cargo routes to go on, and essentially the vessel or the carriers are making the most of those opportunities, which leaves us in the lurch. So if we look, I'll just quickly show this slide. It just highlights how more dominant we are as an importing nation as opposed to an exporting nation. Obviously, Brisbane 2-1, Sydney 3-1, Melbourne essentially 2-1, and Adelaide's really the only port in Australia that exports more than it does imports, which leads into the next slide, which is empty repositioning, which we rely on heavily as an exporting state. So in order to satisfy our export demand, usually containers are resupplied from Sydney, which generally has a large surplus of empty equipment, usually a 3-to-1 ratio. So as you can see above, the containers, the repositioning has dwindled significantly in recent months, but we would normally see around 5,000 TEU 20-foot equivalents per month repositioned into this state to cater for exports. But with the cost of repositioning and demand in other parts of the world, it's becoming more difficult. And you can see here that the actual cost of getting a container ready and prepped is around, well, let's just say the best part of $1,200 for a carrier to get the goods or get those containers to Adelaide. They then may get a backhaul load of wine, let's just say, to wherever market that's going, and they're looking at let's just call it $3,500 for an export load to an end destination. But at present, those carriers are getting empties, those 40s, which I showed you in that previous slide going on that vessel, are demanding spot rate prices of anywhere north of $20,000 per container going to the US or Europe. So it's clearly evident by that alone that they're not overly interested in what we have to offer here. And in fact, it's really just getting containers out as quick as they can to fulfill that demand in other trade lanes, which makes it incredibly difficult for us here in South Australia and Australia as a whole. So again, we're a small volume port here in Adelaide. Our I guess overall, in the global scheme of things, Australia as a whole is. But for exporters out of this state, we're seeing more bypasses and blank sailings. Essentially, as a small port, the carriers are going to look at which is the most cost-effective port to not call to. So if we've got a discharge of 400 TEU of Adelaide imports, they'll discharge that in Melbourne and bypass us, and rather than miss Melbourne and discharge here. So the other part of this is the carriers and their heavy weight, low revenue export cargo, which is an interesting point for wine exports in general. So we have a large portion of Adelaide's export cargo. It's dominated by 20-foot units. We're exporting lead, flexi tanks of wine, bottled wine, grain, copper, minerals, all heavy cargo, which is not conducive of maximising the vessel's utilisation. So most modern vessels are built at a nominal slot capacity of 14 tonne per 20. Each time a line accepts a booking of around 30 tonne, which is approximately what wine would be, or a full wine load, it effectively wipes out another slot that they would otherwise utilise. So naturally, if you take 2 slots, then you've got to pay for that. Hence why rates are a little more expensive, and obviously in the current climate, they're way more expensive. So loss of revenue to lines. In the future, it's likely that a lot of our 20-foot business may be forced into 40-foot units. And you can see here, if they're taking heavyweight cargo, that top layer across the top of the vessel isn't being utilised. It's basically just empty space that's not going anywhere, and hence rates, well, you pay more for that rate for that slot that you're taking. Just some export wine sales figures, which I'm sure most of you guys are across, but we can just see here from year 2018 through to financial year 2021, the volumes that have moved. Obviously, Western Europe, UK, Europe, major player. It did decline significantly 2019 and 2020, but has increased steadily over 2021. US remained fairly consistent across that period. Asia, East Asia has dropped, and then significantly in this period, Scandinavia, Western Europe, all okay. But I guess the key one is China. And if we look at that volume here, we can just see how it's essentially from 2019 through to 2020. It's fairly solid. It's had some ups and downs, but obviously just dropped off a cliff for the last period. And like Jim said, it's probably not coming back anytime soon, which makes it incredibly difficult for you guys. So where to next? Sorry, I've just lost my page. Let's go back here. Let's see here. So where to next? Sorry. Supply chain issues, will they end soon? The short answer is very unlikely. Supply chain professionals would estimate it's at least likely to be another 12 months before the situation eases, probably more, to be honest. We approach the holiday season, demand's going to increase with heightened levels, putting even more strain across an already chaotic system. In time, we should see some easing. As stimulus spending slows, vaccination levels increase, spending moves from consumer goods to services rather than goods, and international travel increases. We should see some slowing of the current situation as people's spending patterns change, and this will obviously take pressure off the supply chain overall. But in theory, rates should subside as demand declines, but there's so many unknown factors. how things will play out, inflationary pressure, government policy, carrier services, they really are all subject to change, and it's a fluid environment. We can't plan for what we're going through at the moment. And Adelaide specifically is a small port. It's hard to predict again. The landscape's definitely going to look different in 12 to 18 months' time. That's a given. Shipping services will no doubt look different. It's going to impact export opportunities for sure. How much, it's remained to be seen. But look, it's not easy. I don't envy importers or exporters over the next 12 to 18 months. And look, it's just difficult. So no crystal balls, but yeah, I'd say it's going to be a little worse before it gets better. So yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ben. More good news, of course.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have too much good news at this stage.
I think the critical element about all that is that this issue is not going to get better anytime soon, and it's going to have pretty severe impacts on our ability to diversify those markets and get that extra product off to try and replace China. So it's
absolutely
a lot of planning, some tough times ahead, but we've just got to make sure we plan well. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. I've got a couple of questions that have been sent through to me. The first one's actually for me, and it's a quick one. It's just, can I quickly update on the China issue? So the World Trade Organization dispute action initiated by the Australian government was announced back in June. In October the 26th, a panel was agreed to be formed. This panel will now adjudicate the dispute. It'll take about 3 years, give or take. The outcome of that panel is actually irrelevant in commercial sense, because what happens is that they will just have to adjust. We will win the case, but they will have to adjust. And if they wish to, they can then pursue another case, taking into account those points of view. The reality is, unless there's a political rekindling of relationships, we won't be back in the China market anytime soon. So that was the first question. I've got a question for Jim. It was, Jim, you alluded in your presentation to that, get those relationships with winemakers and grape growers critically important. Do you have anything to say about the need for contracts and the need for transparency about how, and this is what the question is, how rejections or downgradings are in those contracts?
Yeah, it has to be clear. There has to be openness and integrity. Under the code at the moment, although there's some suspect thing, it's pretty well outlined there how it should be gone about. And in a contract, I know the mob that I deal with at the moment, we're sent out pretty early what those specifications are. And they're not particularly onerous, basically not more than enough mog, keep your fruit disease free. The more difficult one are the quality perceptions. They're very difficult. It's just explain to growers why. Take them through the vineyard and say, look, this is why, this is the problem. And if you can't, well, it shouldn't be rejected. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and thanks, Jim. And there was a sort of a follow-up, and I agree with you. It's really important to get that transparency. And I think that was your point too, is get out, winemakers talk to growers now so they understand, and make sure they understand what those specifications are. The other one relates to the fact the ACCC has just been doing a review of where they came up to on their investigation into the grape and wine industry a couple of years ago. That's due to be released in December. And it was just the question was, is it your view that the ACCC will be watching this vintage very closely?
I would say they're having a very close look at it, yeah. It's since the review from the ACCC, it's probably our first, what a grower would say is a difficult vintage, where fruit's not in big demand. So, yeah, I think they would be looking at it. If there's too much, their first predilection, I think, is to go to a compulsory.
Yeah. So
There's a lot of pressure on that. They'll be looking at things like whether payment terms stretch out again or whether they come back. You know, they're pretty hot on 30-day payments is what they want. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure they'll be having a big look at it.
yeah, and thanks, Jim. That's sort of that's the message I've certainly getting in my chat talk discussions with them as well. And again, they're emphasising to me is to make sure that you get your growers and winemakers to understand exactly what are in their contracts, and for God's sake, have a contract, and then make sure everyone understands it. The next one, probably for me, is India. What are the prospects for India? Look, India is a bit like the Holy Grail. It promises much and delivers very, very little. It's we do have to get in there. I'm enthusiastic about starting discussions. Trade Minister just came back from India, and he met with his counterpart, Minister Goyal. So Dan Tehan met with Goyal. He said it was really productive. There's a very strong desire for them to get what they call as an early harvest agreement by the end of December. And if there is one, then wine is in the frame for being in there, particularly on the tariffs. Don't hold your breath. It's a really difficult ask, but we're in the mix. But experience would say that India's already missed their first deadline, which was to get an exchange of offers by the end of October. So we're hopeful. We want to work on India, but it is a long-term play. It's not going to be a short-term play, but at some stage in 10 years' time, it might well be a reasonably good market. So that was India. On the freight stuff, there is a question which may or may not be for you, Ben, but it refers to the fact that internally there's a lot of domestic freight and how that plays into the international freight scene. And are you seeing that problems of the internal transfers playing in as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you can't export out of Adelaide, where do you go? To the Melbourne market? There's no rail between Adelaide and Melbourne for export loads. So absolutely, internally, shortages everywhere, really. And even then, it's if you can get to another port, you're still looking at equipment availability, slots. So it's nationally, but yeah, domestically is having an impact to a lesser degree, obviously, but yeah, there's certainly issues there on a domestic scale. Yeah.
And hopefully once we get a few borders reopening with COVID, that will alleviate that to some extent.
Yeah.
But again,
Yeah.
I'm hearing that as well, that domestically people are having a lot of trouble getting transport, and so it's again one of these things, plan early and
definitely.
plan well. So I think the big message we're getting everyone is this vintage is a real getting your planning done early, but also the fact that some of these are long-term structural issues that are facing us, or certainly issues such as freight and logistics won't be resolved in the medium term. So we need those clear, transparent discussions. We're working closely with government. There are no solutions for freight and logistics. That's a global problem that unfortunately there is no political solution. Labor, all the discussions we've had have been about all the political answer is that these are training and issues and that need to be resolved in the medium term. So in the short term, as I said, the ag visa will not solve anything for this vintage, may help some for next vintage if they can get a deal done with Cambodia and some of our other labour sources, but not there. So look, we've just run out of time where we've got, so I'd just like to wrap up. I'd like to thank Jim and Ben. If any of you have any more questions, please send them in through offline. Send them through to me or Ali, and we'll be very happy to answer them and provide more updates as we come. So thanks for your time. Thanks for the speakers, and good luck in vintage. And I hope the rain only comes